Good afternoon, everyone. Shiloh here. My pronouns are he and him. I'm here today to talk about some affirming reflections. So today we are going to talk about Joseph and the colorful coat that he wears. So I know a lot of you have asked me about this, and I know in the past I've really wanted to talk about it. And so I finally decided that today is going to be the day that I share kind of some of my thoughts, some of the things that I found, and just some other information that I think is important on this topic, especially now with, queer theology becoming very prominent. We're starting to see a lot of these queer interpretations of stories within the Bible, and so I want to talk a little bit about the story of Joseph. And so if you don't know the story of Joseph, I'll give a quick summary. So the story is found in Genesis 37 up until 45. Good afternoon, Richard. How are you? So again, that's Genesis 37 up to Genesis 45. There's a multitude of stories within that, but the majority of the story of Joseph is in there. It's pretty long, but the summary goes that one of the sons of Israel, or Jacob, named Joseph, was the most loved son of Israel, and he was then given a famous robe of many colors. And so when Joseph reported having dreams to his brothers, and even dreams to his brothers and his family, that his brothers, the stars, the suns, everything would bow before him, their brothers grew in a lot of jealousy and threw him into slavery by selling him to a bunch of Ishmaelites. He was then traveled from there all the way to Egypt, and then was a slave and imprisoned by the Pharaoh there in Egypt. And eventually he rose to being royalty due to his ability to interpret dreams and save the whole country of Egypt from famine. And so he was able to go from being a slave to imprisoned to then being almost equal or second in command to the Pharaoh at that time. So that's a little bit of the story of Joseph. A quick summary, again, it's many, many chapters long. But the main story behind why queer folks like to take the story and see that Joseph could have been or might have been transgender is because of the coat. And so let's dig a little bit further into what this coat means. So here, I'll also be posting a short story on my Facebook page, on the Affirming Ministries page. So if you don't follow that, please make sure to give it a follow, because then you can see all the cool stuff that I post. But it's essentially a short story about the queer interpretation of Joseph, and it is filmed and directed by Peterson Toscano. I'm also going to be implying some of his thoughts from that film into what I'm saying today, so some of it might be a little bit redundant, because he brought a lot of really, really interesting points that I'd like to share with you today. So, before we go any further, I want to talk about Joseph's family. So Joseph comes from, he's the son of Jacob. And so if we look at the story of Jacob before he became Israel, he had a twin brother named Esau. And so some of you may know, obviously, the story of Jacob and Esau. They were twins. Esau was the firstborn, and Jacob followed along with his heel. And we see a huge distinctiveness between both Jacob and Esau. So we see that Esau was a burly, hairy man, lots of muscle. He was the one that hunted and gathered food. And then we saw that Jacob was actually quite different. He was hairless, he was smooth, he was often with his mother, he was the one that helped cook. He dwelt among the tents, as some would say. And at that time, a lot of men actually didn't cook any food. I know we see stories of Jesus later on, but in the Old Testament, it was mostly the women that were cooking. And then we see, Esau is about to get his father's blessing, and of course the mother wants Jacob to have the blessing, and so she disguises Jacob to look like and act like Esau. And to do that, they actually grab lambskin and put it over his arm so that he seems to be hairy. And that then Jacob brings this dish of goat meat and brings it to his father to get the blessing, and then he leaves and comes back, and there's another story within that. But we see already that Joseph's father, Jacob, was already quite a feminine man, just because of his lack of hunting skills, his lack of burliness, the fact that he wasn't as hairy as most of the other men at the time. So that's kind of a little bit of Jacob and where Joseph's father comes from. Then if we take a look at some of the description words of Joseph, we see that Joseph was the favored son of Jacob. He was, I think, the 11th son that was born, or yeah, the 11th son that was born out of all 12. So he was definitely not the last, but definitely not the first, but he seemed to be still the favored son. He was very verbal about the dreams that he was having, which most would say that was the reason why there was a lot of jealousy between him and his brothers. But the main part of the queer interpretation of the story is that Jacob favored Joseph so much that Jacob actually gives Joseph this colorful coat. So there's many different English ways of saying it. I've heard, you know, the movie, the Technicolor dream coat, there's the colorful coat, there's the striped coat, multicolored tunic. There's multiple different English ways of saying it, but essentially it was some sort of over-the-body, torso-wearing fabric that was of significant color or ornament. Some English translations even say that it was like some sort of coat or robe with long sleeves, and that's some of the Hebrew that's within it. But if you look at most Bible stories, or most study Bibles that have more interpretations or translation notes at the bottom, most Bibles will say that this Hebrew word to describe what the coat is actually unclear. So we see that Joseph was favored by Jacob, and for me, after looking into this, I don't think he was favored just because of his ability to dream or his futured ability to become a royalty, but I think he was mostly favored by Jacob because, and this is probably I don't officially know, but based off of my findings, I assume and I think that Jacob favored Joseph mostly because he was the firstborn son of Rachel. And so Rachel was his quote-unquote true wife. It was the wife that he wanted to marry. It was the person that he loved and that he fell in love with. But then in the journey of his story, he was then, you know, tricked into marrying Leah first, and then he eventually married Rachel. And then the story goes that Leah bears him many sons, then he also has multiple sons with some other concubines, and then it is Rachel that finally is able to conceive a son, who is then Joseph. And so that is kind of where I think the favoritism does come from, is from this idea that he, you know, loved Rachel, wanted Rachel to begin with, and then he was forced to stay with Leah, and then taking on the responsibility of also marrying Rachel. And so because he is Rachel's firstborn, I think that is where some of the favoritism will come from. Because you even see in the text that Joseph is considered a beautiful man. He's very attractive, very beautiful. And some of the Hebrew words and sentences that are used to describe how beautiful Joseph is almost word to word with how Rachel is then described in earlier chapters, with how she is described as also being very beautiful. And so I think the reasoning for that is, yeah, the beautifulness of Joseph looking like his mother, and Jacob obviously loving Rachel more than Leah, and that is the whole point of of those past stories and jealousy and stuff like that, which is a whole other topic. So let's get down to the robe. So I'm going to preface this. There is not a lot of information about this type of interpretation. This story of Joseph being trans isn't very old. It's a rather new interpretation, and because of that, there isn't a lot of scholarly articles or effort being made to talk about or to research some of the language behind uh, this term of coat. And so because it's very new, there isn't a lot of information. And so what I have for you today is just some of the stuff that I was able to muster up and find. But if I do see any new information or anything that changes the narrative, I will definitely do a part 2 update. So from what I got so far, this is what we have. So in the modern world, we see that color is everywhere. I mean, you can even see in the background I got a colorful thing of my dog. Super colorful. And everything else I wear is dark and gray and black. So I don't have a lot of color myself, but we see it so much in our world, but in biblical times, we see that color wasn't really popular. It was very expensive to dye things or have anything that was luxury based because of it being so expensive. Especially that's why the color purple is seen as a royalty color, is because of the dye that is used to make the color purple was just so expensive that only royal people or people who had a lot of money were able to afford it. So a lot of the stuff that they were wearing were pretty much just cloth, a basic beige, white, dark colors. And so to the cost of having such a colorful cloth or a colorful coat was just seen as a way of, having, multiple children and giving a few of your children, a few trinkets and then giving one child like $1 million. So that's kind of how it felt for a lot of the siblings at the time, that, you had all of these children, and then all of a sudden one of your siblings is getting this very expensive, very colorful, long coat. And so that is kind of where this idea of the special favoring is shown by the father, and that is why then the brothers eventually do wish to kill him, but then deliver him and sell him into slavery. And then hence the story goes. So some of the translators of the NIV version note that the Hebrew word for varicolored is actually quite ambiguous. So a lot of the most accurate way of describing it would be ordinate. So it's a very not colorful, but very expressive in a way. Oh, Pat, hello. I'm talking about Joseph and the coat. I haven't gotten too far. I guess I can do a quick summary. Obviously, the story of Joseph, as you know. And I just talked about how Jacob, Joseph's father, was quite an effeminate man. He wasn't very, burly or strong, like his twin brother Esau. And then later seeing that Joseph is considered the firstborn son of Rachel, which was Jacob's first wife that he wanted to marry, but was stuck then marrying Leah. And so that is why probably the favoritism was happening, is because Jacob loved Rachel and saw Rachel as beautiful, and thus Joseph, being the firstborn son, being a higher status. And now I'm just talking about the robe, where having a colorful robe is very expensive, and so that is kind of in part of where the jealousy came from with the brothers and selling him into slavery. So we see that other translations say that there is sometimes translating them to be striped, so it could have been like a striped coat, which probably would have been the easiest way of threading that type of coat back in that time. But what is the word, and where else is it? So why are queer people saying that, Joseph is trans? Why are we saying this? And it is because the Hebrew term is called ketonet pasio, and that is the translating word here. And so this garment is actually featured multiple times during the Joseph narrative in Genesis, but there's only one other mention in all of the Bible that uses the same term, and the other occasion is also later in 2 Samuel, chapter 13, verses 18 to 19, and we see that the Bible mentions ketonet pasiem again when Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. And so it's obviously a horrific story, and one that is sad to hear, but eventually what happens is she's wearing this long robe with sleeves. And then the story also states that, for this is how virgin daughters of the king were clothed in earlier times. And so the Bible literally says that. That is a direct quote from 2 Samuel. And so we have this Hebrew word, ketonet pasiam, and the Bible defining that word being a long robe with sleeves, which accurately translates to, like a coat or some sort of garment that Joseph is wearing. So we see that those two things are the same. But the difference is that, the 2 Samuel specifies that this type of coat or this type of robe was to be worn by women, and especially not even just women, but high status women. So women that were, daughters of the king, who were princesses, and this is kind of where the translation of Joseph being wearing a princess dress comes from, and so there's many different ways of interpreting it, and so one of the things that we have to talk about is that there has to be at least one possibility, and that possibility is that Jacob gave Joseph a female garment, based off of the Hebrew term and the sentence in 2 Samuel stating that this type of garment was worn by women and high status women. That has to be an interpretation that we have to consider when we're talking about Joseph. Sorry, my cat is rubbing my webcam here and moving the camera. And then we see that also with, Joseph, getting a lot of violence towards him from his brothers, not only because of the favoritism that Jacob is showing, but also the fact that he was able to get this coat that was super expensive, but also if the coat happened to be a female garment, that could also be a trigger, I guess, towards why the brothers were so inherently violent and hateful towards Joseph, was because of his femininity, his being effeminate, being a soft man, those kind of things. And so, yeah, so some of the queer interpretations we have here is that Joseph's coat was not, in fact, a colorful robe, but was, in fact, some sort of dress or princess dress. I don't think that that is accurate, to be honest. I don't think calling it a princess dress really accurately describes what it is. I think princess dress in our society means something very different. I think we all have our internal biases towards what that means. Like when I think of it, I think of this pretty Disney princess dress. But in reality, it states that it was some sort of long robe that virgin daughters wore. I don't think it would have been something that was very colorful, I think. Obviously, you wanted your virgin daughters to look nice and be presentable because at that time you wanted to sell your daughters towards other men, or create some sort of partnerships with other tribes, and so thus you would then trade your daughter for that protection. So virgin daughters were seen as in themselves ornaments, and thus why they would be wearing some sort of long robe. It doesn't state that her robe was colorful, whereas Joseph's does. And I think maybe that has to do with just, the richness that Jacob had. But it also could be just foreshadowing or foreseeing the royalty that Joseph then gets when he is enslaved in Egypt. So there's many different ways of why it could have been that, but we can move on as well. So we see that I have a quote here by Buff. This person wrote a blog about, Joseph being a trans person, or at least personifying what a trans person would be in biblical times. And this is what they said. Queer folks don't have that luxury. I grew up seeing only images of straight cis people in God's story. Eventually, I learned to find the possible LGBT characters hiding in the text. David and Jonathan, Mary and Martha. They're in the shadows, masked by circumspect language and unaffirming translations. But they are there. And if Joseph wore a princess dress, then, for the first time, I see someone in our Holy Scripture who is like me. Someone who bends or even breaks the expectations of gender. I can read the story of my faith tradition, the story of my Savior and see it in the radical possibility that God loves even me. Because God has done it before, God loved and protected Joseph, even through hardships. And so, because of this, there were a few conservative responses to Mac's blog. A lot of them, obviously, were quite unaffirming, so I would suggest not reading them. Some of them are quite harsh. But some of the responses that I was seeing from conservative Christians is that, just because the translation is ambiguous and that, it could have been a female garment doesn't mean that Joseph was queer or doesn't mean that Joseph was trans, and that people are trying to change the true meaning of the story, or that the Bible is being tainted by queer stories. But for me, I personally don't think Joseph was trans, based off of kind of some of the reasonings that I have. I do think that he was gender expressive, for sure. I do think he wasn't as stereotypical male as, his uncle was or as his brothers were. I think him and Jacob both have very interesting stories, and that they are expressive in their own masculinity in ways that other men at that time weren't, and I think that is awesome, and I think that is something that we should be talking about more, that there are a lot more, feminine men in the Bible, and that we need to talk about them as being good and not being seen as a bad thing. But I also do see the power in behind seeing yourself in certain stories and certain people. And so to say that, Joseph was given a female garment, I do think that is a complete possibility. And the fact that Joseph could have been trans is also a complete possibility. And so I think that either option is good. I think regardless if he was trans or not, I think that doesn't take away from the main story of, redemption and God's grace and guiding providence and all of these things that, are more thematic when it comes to the story. But I think it's important to, as trans people, as allies, to read these stories in different lenses. I think, reading the story as Joseph being trans, I think opens my eyes up to different ways in which I can be represented within the Bible. And I think it's important to have multiple different people from different, backgrounds, from different experiences, to read and share their findings in the Bible, because the way we read into it is going to shine different stories for us. And that is one thing I really love about the Bible, is that it's very, very different for a lot of different people. And so to give a little quick summary for folks who are just tuning in, Joseph is seen as being potentially a transgender character due to his colorful coat. So his father, Jacob, gave him a colorful coat that is often translated as a long sleeve coat, but the direct translation is unsure, and that's essentially there are multiple different ways to interpret it, and one of the interpretations that are accurate is that it was a female garment that virgin daughters wear of kings, and so there is a possibility that he was trans, and that he identified as female, and that is why Jacob gave him a female garment, or that it isn't a female garment and that it is just a traditional coat that anyone wears, and that is why Jacob gave it to him. So there's many different answers. Unfortunately, I don't have a concrete answer for you. I wish I did, but I think both interpretations are equally accurate. I think saying that Joseph is trans is not far-fetched at all. I think it is a possibility for sure, based off of the information that we have and the translation words that we have right now. And so yeah, and I want to end off today. If anyone has any questions, feel free to shoot them in the comments. For those that are wondering, there's also a lot more that goes into what I am trying to... Sorry, the cat is in the way. Move out of my way. One of the things I was reading is the sexual orientation of the presentation of Joseph's character in biblical and rabbinic literature. It's very, very long, by Robert Harris, but I think a lot of the stuff that he mentions is really important. I think it was just too long to include in this live stream. So I'll probably do a part 2 based on some of the findings that he has. He also talks about just the sexuality behind Joseph when it comes to him not having sex with I think it was the prison guard's wife, and then the fact that he only has two kids in the future. The way that he responds to his family once he's reunited with them is a very different way of responding as a man would at that time. So there's multiple different queernesses of Joseph, which I find fascinating. Some of it didn't really work well with the coat, and that's what I wanted to focus on today. So I'll probably do a little bit more looking into Joseph and kind of the queerness behind him. Aaron, thank you. I think the beautiful thing is that there is no concrete answer. It means all the possibilities can stay open. Exactly, and I think that's a great way of having it. I don't believe that we'll ever fully understand and have concrete answers when it comes to things like this. But I do find joy in, finding stories like this and finding the fun, queer ways in which we can see ourselves and see it. And then Pan says, I wonder if there's any censorship in this sense, and if they may have had trans characters, but even they were cut from the final books of the Bible. 100%. Oh my goodness. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, I 100% agree. And now I'll be posting I think, Pan, I think you missed my announcement of that. I'll be posting a short story done by Peterson Toscano, I think his last name is. It's like 15 minutes long, and it shares the story about Joseph from a queer perspective. And he talks about that exactly, the censorship of, in past biblical times, it was, usually cis men of high status were able to read and write, and so they were the ones sharing the stories. Even later now, within the last 100 years, it's always been, rich, white, cis men, straight men, exactly, that have been funding and writing and translating and doing all of these stuff. And even the study Bible I have, most of it's written by, cis white men or even cis white women. And so I find it hard to even take a look at this and fully believe what I'm reading inside of it. Thankfully, my study Bible actually quotes 2 Samuel from the translation, whereas most Bible books don't. My other one I can't check because it's at the church. But so even just like reading and looking upon some of the stories and the study Bibles that I have, I'm often I take it with a grain of salt. And that's one thing that I'm really excited for in the next 10, 20, not even 10 to 20 years. In the next 5 to 10 years, we're seeing a lot more people of color, folks who are disabled, folks who are queer, going into ministry and doing a lot of this research and a lot of this work and taking these stories and really looking at it from a different lens. And we're starting to see the Bible being broken into and broken up in ways that we've never seen ever in history. And so I'm really excited to be a part of that and to see kind of where it goes. And so yeah, I'll be posting that video shortly, so if you want to learn a little bit more, please feel free to jump in and watch it. It's really good. Like I said, some of the stuff that I took from today I stole from Peter, but I wanted to post his video on the Affirming Ministries page. I'll also share it on the Robertson Leslie page. Just for people to see, because I think it was just a fascinating way of how he explains where Joseph is coming from, where it's at, and how the translations really affected everything. And so if you want to learn a little bit more about that, watch that. And if you want a more in-depth, quite lengthy, long type essay story, the sexual orientation done by Robert Harris was really, really well done. And it actually includes a lot of the Greek and Hebrew translations within the document, so you can actually see what the words look like in Hebrew, which I find always very fascinating. I'm going to end off on a poem that actually Robert Harris has in the ending of his essay. It's a poem called She is Joseph, and it was done by an Israeli poet, Nusri Zahari, and it goes like this. She dwells, does Rachel, In the tent, curl of hair upon curl, does she gather to hide under a covering of silk the hair of her small daughter, Joseph. She dwells, does a small one, in a tent in a cloak, with stripes adorned, revealed. She is a boy, but hidden a girl. And so I just thought it was a really awesome poem that kind of goes behind kind of where, queer theology is taking us when it comes to looking at these stories. I think there is a great argument for it, and I think there's also a great argument against it. And so thus, for me personally, I don't think Joseph is trans, but I think that we can see Joseph as a potential gender diverse trans character, and I think that is totally okay to do so because scripture and interpretations allow us to have that as an option. And so yeah, so those are kind of some of my findings from this. Again, like I said, it's very new theology when it comes to this kind of story, so there wasn't much to go off of. But I'm hoping to do potentially a second episode of Joseph, but I might just do a more wider, longer live stream of some of the queer folks within it, and I might even just do a queer people in the Bible series, and I talk about one or the other, and kind of do a series throughout the Bible of folks that, and yeah, so I want to do kind of some sort of series of trans characters or queer characters that we see in the Bible, such as, some of the stuff that I mentioned earlier, such as that, what was his name? Mac stated with, David and Jonathan and Mary and Martha and even Naomi. There's a bunch of queer stories that are being brought to life, and I'd really like to shed some light on those. So, and Pan says, I can't wait for a new rendition of Joseph, the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat with trans lives. That would be amazing, because I loved the movie as a kid. That one and The Prince of Egypt, those two movies just blew me away. I remember them as a kid. I always thought it was weird because I didn't grow up in the church, and so everyone always thought it was weird that I watched it. But it was just such a good movie, and so I'd love to see a trans version of it. I think that would be really interesting and really cool. So anyway, that's all I have for today. I will see you all next Monday at noon. I don't know what I'm going to do it on, so I'm going to figure that out today. But go check out that video. I'm going to post it right away after I end this. So, okay, take care.